So last time we saw that Joseph finally revealed his identity to his brothers after they returned with their younger brother, or his younger brother, Benjamin, to buy grain. Joseph told them to hurry back to Canaan and bring their father Jacob and the entire family down to Egypt. Now, although the biblical text only mentions 70 Israelites who eventually settled in Egypt, there must have been more, particularly women in the party. There were at least 11 more, the wives of Joseph's brothers, that aren't mentioned in the listings and aren't counted among those who went down. When Israel and the family made it into Egypt, Joseph went out to meet them and continued with them into the land of Goshen. Look again at the Lower Egypt map. There's an excellent article about the land of Goshen and its name in the Jewish Encyclopedia, and I'll put a link to that in the notes for this study. So, although the land of Goshen was in the vicinity of the rich and fertile Nile Delta, the annual Nile floods didn't make it all the way into Goshen consistently. And so the area was, although it was close to the Nile Delta, it was unsuitable for agriculture. However, it did offer good pasture for large herds of livestock. And so as we take up the story here in Genesis 46, verse 31, we'll see that Joseph sort of, I won't say manipulated, but that's really what he did, Pharaoh into allowing his family to go to Goshen. In verse 31 of Genesis 46, then, it says, Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds, and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So Joseph was the top administrator in the Egyptian government, and he had a complete understanding of the Egyptian economy and population. He therefore knew that the land of Goshen would be the perfect place for herdsmen like his family to live, and so he set up arranging things with Pharaoh to make that happen. Now, the Egyptians may have abhorred shepherds for a few different reasons, for dietary reasons, or for religious reasons, or for cultural reasons. Some historians have proposed that Egyptians were vegetarians and abhorred the eating of meat. However, we know for certain that the Egyptians of Joseph's time did raise livestock, particularly cattle, and that would beg the question why they raised animals if they weren't going to eat them. The Egyptians may also have found that the Hebrew practice of sacrificing livestock as burnt offerings to God, they may have found that to be blasphemous, since some of the animals were considered sacred by the Egyptians. So, and then finally, Egypt was a settled agrarian, quote, civilized society, with each person having strong ties to the land. And the Egyptians were also deeply nationalistic and xenophobic, tending to have sort of a haughty and distrusting attitude toward foreigners. Conversely, the Hebrew herdsmen were nomadic people living in tents and moving around with their flocks as water and pasture was available. And the Egyptians considered such nomads to be uncivilized. Better, more thorough treatment of this subject can be found at the Armstrong Institute website, and I'll leave a link to that in the description of this video and in the notes that accompanying it. But for whatever reason that the Egyptians abhorred shepherds, Joseph was aware of that and turned it to his family's advantage in their audience with Pharaoh. So continuing in chapter 47 in verse 1, it says, "So Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, 'My father and my brothers with their flocks and herds and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen.' And from among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, 'What is your occupation?' And they said to Pharaoh, 'Your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were.' They said to Pharaoh, 'We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen.' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock.'" So if Pharaoh personally abhorred shepherds, he didn't let on. After all, he almost certainly knew that Joseph, his most trusted deputy, had come from a family of nomadic herdsmen. Clearly, Pharaoh also realized that Goshen was the best place for them to live in Egypt, and it was a win-win for him since he could then hire the Hebrew shepherds to tend his own livestock. Behind the scenes, of course, God Almighty had been directing all of these events in the lives of the Israelites in Canaan and in Egypt ever since he called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans and told him to journey to the land that he would show him in Genesis 11. So continuing in verse 7, "Then Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to Jacob, 'How many are the days of the years of your life?' And Jacob said to Pharaoh, 'The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil,' and that word is ra, 'have been the days and of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning.' And Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and Pharaoh went out from the presence, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh." So this Hebrew word ra, that's translated as evil in the ESV and most other English language translations, can also mean unpleasant or difficult. It's sad that Joseph looked back on his life this way. After all, God had visited Jacob on several occasions. He'd reiterated the promises that he'd made to Abraham and Isaac to give their descendants the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession. And furthermore, God had blessed Jacob with wives and children and grandchildren and wealth. What more did Jacob expect out of life? These verses are also intriguing in that Jacob blessed Pharaoh rather than vice versa. After all, Pharaoh was certainly the most powerful person in Egypt and possibly throughout the whole region at the time. Yet here, a lowly herdsman was blessing him. The greater, almost all universally, blesses the lesser. Yet Pharaoh accepted Jacob's blessing and made polite inquiry about Jacob's age and his life. Maybe Pharaoh was simply deferring to Jacob's age. Jacob's own blunt statement that he had not attained to the same years that his fathers had was certainly true, but at 130, Jacob was, he'd lived a long, full life. Deference to our elders, simply because they are our elders, is a time-honored tradition and principle that's kind of fallen out of favor in our modern world, particularly in the West. But it might be well if we brought it back. Anyway, continuing in verse 11, "Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded." And Ramesses was a city on the western edge of the land of Goshen. "And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food according to the number of their dependents. Now, Ramesses was the capital city of Egypt at the time. And so when Joseph said that by living in Goshen, his family would be close to him, using that play on words of the name Goshen, which means drawing near, he was physically near to them, since he would have been headquartered out of the capital city, Ramesses. So over the next 5 years, Joseph continued to act as Pharaoh's representative in distributing the food that had been stored up during the 7 years of plenty. And Joseph, acting in Pharaoh's behalf during the last years of the famine, essentially nationalized the entire economy of Egypt. In verse 13 it says, "Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reasons of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house." Now, just like the Canaanites, the Egyptians of the time didn't use struck coins like we think of as money. The money here was precious metal by weight, usually silver. And in verse 15, continuing, "And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, 'Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone.' And Joseph answered, 'Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone.' So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year." Now, I have to admit, I'm a little confused by this, why Joseph and Pharaoh would want to take livestock in exchange for the food stored during the 7 years of plenty. To my mind, owning livestock during a famine would be a liability rather than an asset. The livestock need food and they need water, and so they represented an expense rather than an income to Pharaoh's coffers. Maybe the livestock that they took in was then slaughtered, and the meat was preserved by drying or salting, with maybe just a small remnant of the livestock being kept as breeding stock once the famine came to an end. Continuing then in verse 18, "And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, 'We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh, and give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate.' So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's." Now, it's not clear from the biblical account just what caused the 7-year famine in Egypt and Canaan. Maybe it was a prolonged drought. That region of the eastern Mediterranean is arid in the best of times. A multi-year drought would have just devastated the land. Nevertheless, the soil remained fertile. All that was needed was water. Knowing that the drought wouldn't last forever, Joseph and Pharaoh nationalized the land against the coming day when the rain and the snow in the mountains of the Upper Nile would return and the annual floods would make the land fertile again. Then in verse 21, "As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priest he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowances that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, 'Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land, and at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as for food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones.' And they said, 'You have saved our lives. May it please the Lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh.' So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. So this last step in Pharaoh's nationalization of the Egypt economy was this statute that Joseph had made that turned all the people into sharecroppers instead of independent landowners. All the land of Egypt became Pharaoh's except what was owned by the priests, and the people were allowed to live on the land and to work it and receive its produce on the condition that 20% of the produce went to Pharaoh first. Notice that this statute also applied to the Hebrews in Joseph's family as well as the native Egyptians. Later, the Hebrews would become outright slaves working on Pharaoh's public works projects. They continued to manage their flocks and their herds, but 1/5 of the livelihood they derived went to Pharaoh in accordance with this statute. So next time we'll look at the final years of Jacob's life in the land of Egypt, the land of Goshen, and the dying blessings that he bestowed upon Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh.